Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Differential Understanding. I'm your host, Grace Shao. I also write the newsletter AI Proem on Substack, where I cover APAC AI, tech, spatial intelligence, and robotics. Joining me today is Paul Triolo, a partner at DGA-Albright Stonebridge Group, where he advises companies on technology, policy, and geopolitical risks, especially things around China. Now, Paul is one of the leading experts on China-US technology competition, from semiconductors and export controls to AI regulation supply chains. Before DGA, he founded and led the geotechnology practice at Eurasia Group. And before that, he spent more than 25 years in the US government analyzing China's rise as a technology power. He also began his career as an engineer at a semiconductor testing company in Silicon Valley. So he brings a rare mix of technical, policy, and geopolitical experience. Today, the goal is to better understand how US export controls force China from a globalized chip supply chain into a crash program to build an indigenous AI compute stack. Hi, Paul. Thank you so much for joining. Really excited to have you on. And I feel like you're the perfect person for a few of the questions I have prepared in the beginning of the podcast before we get into the actual topic. There are so many things happening and I can't keep up with like Twitter these days.
It's hard to keep up.
So supposedly Reuters reporting saying Beijing is restricting foreign users in accessing Chinese models. Like, what is that all about? What's your view on that?
In the wake of the Fable Mythos fiasco, if you will, in the US, and the capabilities of these advanced models getting really good and getting into areas like cybersecurity and biosecurity, I think it's not surprising that the Chinese government is at least considering what to do about open weight more properly models that are reaching sort of frontier level capabilities, particularly DeepSeek and then even more recently, Meituan and other. So I think my sense is this is just preliminary discussions with the labs about this issue because, even in the US, there's lots of confusion about what the government's role should be here in determining when models are released and under what circumstances and how do you measure capabilities. Even though the US has been thinking about this for a while, and I'm sure that's to some degree it's happening in China, there's no general agreement on how do you do this. And these companies in China, as you know, are all commercial companies that, just like in the US, are under a lot of pressure to continue to put out models. And so I think I would not read too much into that. I think that it's clear that the Chinese government is trying to figure out what to do about this, but I don't think they've reached any conclusion about which models to control and how to control them. They're learning from the companies. They're probably going out and saying, how do companies themselves evaluate these models internally, in terms of capabilities that could be of concern, and what should the Chinese government eventually do? I mean, they'll do something eventually, but I think we're in the early stages still, as a result of the pretty much of the Fable and Mythos issue in the U.S., which got a lot of attention.
Yeah, for sure. I think, Zhipu, Minimax, these companies are public listed. Like they actually face, just shareholder pressure as well. But the one thing, the nuance is Chinese companies usually are a bit more prepared or aware of potential regulatory, I guess, involvement. So yeah, let's wait and see because I read this and I was like, oh, this seems a bit counterintuitive, frankly, to the model's goals going forward.
The headline was a little out in front here.
Mm.
I think it's clear that there's concern as these models become more capable about what to do about tiered releasing. But this is a more general discussion I think that's happening. It doesn't surprise to people who've been following this sector for a long time. The idea that we would be here at this moment, was not surprising. The problem is the ability of governments to keep up with the pace of development of the technology is just clearly here. It's woefully inadequate to the moment because within these large AI labs, and I'm now calling DeepSeek and Zhipu along with Anthropic and OpenAI, the top four global frontier AI labs. Researchers understand these issues and they're really concerned about this because particularly things like recursive self-improvement, which means the models are basically training, not training themselves, but they're optimizing some of the the orchestration or the harnessing, that the sort of platforms that these things operate on, that's a growing concern because the models themselves now are able to improve the overall ecosystem without human intervention, right? And that people miss that, I think, in the US with all the fable mythos kerfluffle. The Anthropic released a blog that talked about this, that recursive self-improvement is now sort of part of the landscape. And so that's also, I think, part of the concern, including within the Chinese government about, okay, Chinese labs are getting pretty good. What should the government, how should the government think about some framework around release of these models?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, in China, usually the regulators and the industry actually work pretty close together. So hopefully, people can regulators can keep up, will hopefully catch up on understanding technology a bit faster and better. Okay, so another quick commentary on what is happening in the news. Supposedly, DeepSeek and CAI are going out and making their own chips. What is happening? What is your high level view on this?
No, this is not surprising. In the US, of course, some of the hyperscalers and more of the hyperscalers like Google and AWS have long determined that it would be useful to have specially designed ASICs, application-specific integrated circuits, that are optimized for running certain workloads in their cloud. Um, and optimize and now optimized for models, specifically for large advanced models. General purpose GPUs, which is what Nvidia and AMD produce, maybe suboptimal. But this is a complicated issue because to do design, this is a whole nother thing than building models. And so for both Jirpu um, DeepSeek, this requires building a team of some semiconductor design engineers, right? And they're not a lot of these guys laying around that are not gainfully employed, particularly for designing really sophisticated chips here. So I think it's not surprising that they want to do this, but I would be, again, sort of a little bit skeptical that they're going to be able to do this within the next year. Even you have to build a team. It's expensive. You have to get advanced semiconductor design tools, electronic design automation tools, and then you have to begin figuring out where you're going to manufacture these, right? And in China, of course, as we know, because of export controls, these companies are likely going to have to use SMIC, the domestic foundry. So they'll be competing with all the other players, all the other GPU designers, the general purpose GPU designers like BREN and More Threads, a lot of these companies that, as you know, have gone public recently, they're all vying for this limited capacity at SMIC to manufacture these advanced designs at, let's say 7 nanometers, which is a feature size of these chips. So I think it's really interesting that they're going to do this, but it's going to be a challenge on two fronts. One is, assembling a team, sustain team over time. This is expensive. It's very expensive. Lenovo tried to do this, for example, at one point. They were considering getting into semiconductor design, but they determined that it was too expensive and it was going to be a long-term drain potentially, if depending on the success of these teams. And so, I think if anybody can do it, I mean, DeepSeek seems to already have a lot of expertise on hardware and understand the hardware really well. But semiconductor design is another whole nother discipline, if you will. And then in China, it comes with the added constraint that you're sort of stuck with SMIC, and maybe Huahong down the road will have some kind of 7 nanometer process. Um, but it's a tricky thing. But again, the trend in the industry is to do this. So in the US, you have OpenAI, I think, and Anthropic are both also considering designing their own semiconductors. So
Yeah, they
it's
have partnerships as well with other vendors. So help me understand. I think twofold. One is, what is SMIC's role in China, and what is their biggest bottleneck for them to actually churn out better chips? One thing you said is capacity. Other thing you said is access to certain technology, instruments, machinery. The other part of the question, if you can fold into it, is who are the actual players? So DeepSeek Group wants to build their own, create their own chips, but Baba's in this, Baidu's in this. There's a lot of big tech trying to create their own chips as well. How do we understand all their relationships in the ecosystem?
A lot in there to unpack. So let's just look at the demand side, then we can look at the supply side. So the demand side is, as I started to allude to there, is pretty heavy, right? So you have Huawei, right? They're designing the Ascends, and those are all at least the most advanced node, which is this horrible technical term for the process that is used to manufacture these at SMIC, for example, here. And so Huawei has a lot of demand, and in the past, Huawei given most of the capacity at SMIC just because at a year ago or 2 years ago, there weren't as many other players. Now there are. Now it's more complicated. But certainly the Chinese government probably also heavily weighed in to have SMIC prioritize Huawei production, both for their smartphone, their Kirin smartphone, and for the Ascend processors for AI. But now in the last year, we have two additional sets of companies vying for this capacity at SMIC. One is the sort of GPU makers in China, the startups, and this is BREN, Moorthreads, SoftGo, Inflame, Illuvitar. There's a couple more too, but those five are sort of the top companies. And some of those companies were started by engineers from Nvidia and AMD. And so their designs are really advanced, and they're more compatible with the Nvidia ecosystem, et cetera, et cetera. So they're all now producing GPUs at SMIC, and there's allocation issues. When I was in China recently, I heard that one of those companies had been promised a certain number of wafers at SMIC, but then one of the big hyperscalers had come in and offered more money. And so SMIC had said, okay, well, we're going to reduce your allocation, right? So there's a lot of fighting for that. And then the other group that you just mentioned here are the companies like Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, and then now the model developers like DeepSeek and Zhipu that are also doing their own designs. And I think, again, as you noted, Baidu and Tencent and Alibaba are farther along on this. They have semiconductor design teams which are already producing, in the case of Alibaba, PPUs. In the case of Tencent, they have dedicated ASICs. They've been doing this for a while, sort of under the radar. Tencent's a very capable company, and they're really good at this, right? It turns out, but they're very low key on this. And then Baidu, of course, with Kunlun Sin, which is also going to go public on the Hong Kong market. So the other part of this also is that all these companies, of course, need capital to function and to do all these designs and to hire these engineers and to do all this stuff. So in the last year, we've seen these companies tap into capital markets, particularly the GPU makers and the new GPU startups have gone in Hong Kong and in Shanghai. And then we've seen DeepSeek, of course, raise 7 billion in funding from a variety of sources, and part of that will go to presumably the issue of the team and designing their own chips. And then of course Zhipu went public, and its stock is crazy high if you look at the valuation on Hong Kong. So it's a new game where Chinese companies are all playing this game of designing their own chips. And then of course they're all competing for this capacity at SMIC. So now we can turn to SMIC, right? So SMIC is this crazy company, right? That for a long time was sort of a little bit under the radar. But under heavy US export controls. So that started in around 2018, 2019, when they had actually ordered a very advanced lithography machine from ASML, which produces all of the advanced lithography machines, extreme ultraviolet lithography, EUV lithography. So they were denied that. They actually ordered it. And then the Dutch government, under pressure from the US government, and Wassenaar, which is this interagency or intercountry group, this multilateral group, pulled that license from them. So for the last 6 years, SMIC has been using its deep ultraviolet lithography, which is the second best, but pretty good. They've been pushing their suite of DUV machines to the utmost limits to try to get to these lower and more advanced nodes. And 7 nanometers is sort of the limit, 7 and maybe 5 It's complicated. Some layers of these semiconductors can be, they don't all have to be at the most advanced levels. But they've been doing something that nobody else in the world has done. Now, in Taiwan, they did use some of the techniques is using, but when they had access to the more advanced lithography, they went to that because the throughput is faster and the yields are better. So SMIC is trying to do something that no other company would have to do because of U.S. export controls, and that means pushing these lithography machines to their limits. But obviously they're being successful, but there's a limit to sort of the yield too that they can do. So, for example, the AI semiconductors are much more complicated than for a smartphone handset. So for the smartphone handset, they get a pretty good yield, say over 90%. But for the GPUs or the NPUs, as Huawei is using, the yields are much lower because these are very complicated and dense chips, right? And so using some of these advanced techniques, it's just hard to do, right? And you end up with not as many useful chips at the end because the yields are just, you can't do it because you're sort of pushing the machines to the limit of their capabilities. So, but over the next 6 months, it looks like they're going to bring online, SMIC is going to bring online more capacity at these advanced nodes, maybe double its capacity, because obviously there's so much demand for these chips in China that SMIC is responding to this demand and is putting in place more production lines in Shanghai, by the way, at SMIC South, to produce, to meet the demand for all of these AI, primarily not just AI, but mostly AI optimized hardware because of those three batches of companies. Huawei is sort of a batch in its own right, but then the GPU makers, the startups, and then the ASIC makers. So the challenge then is who decides who gets capacity, right? And as I said, I've heard a lot of anecdotal, chatter in China about that. It's very complicated. The government obviously weighs in to favor certain companies, but then there's a tremendous amount of competition. And then finally, the other piece of this, it's not just the logic, if you will, the sort of core. It's also memory, right? So more so for the AI hardware, high bandwidth memory is a really important part of that because these advanced GPUs are packaged with lots of memory on the actual package, within the actual package, co-packaged, if you will, with the logic. And there, of course, U.S. export controls again have affected CXMT in particular. This case, the Changxian memory, which is in Hefei and other places in Beijing. I just saw a big fab in Beijing when I was there. And so but again, it turns out that memory to some of the export control restrictions on memory is not quite as hard as it is for logic, although it's not easy. And so CXMT is also ramping up its production of high bandwidth memory, which would then be packaged with those dies. Huawei in particular stockpiled a lot of HBM in 2024 before the U.S. controls were put in place from what Samsung and SK Hynix, some of the South Korean producers, which are leading in actually up high bandwidth memory. So it's a combination of several bottlenecks that the Chinese domestic semiconductor industry is trying to overcome to meet this demand for these AI this AI optimized hardware, whether it's the Ascend series from Huawei or these other GPUs or these other ASICs that are now being designed by both the hyperscalers and the model developers like Driftwood and DeepSeek.
I appreciate that context. I think for me, like I've been reading about SMIC for a long time, but that just really clarifies exactly their role in the ecosystem. And it's interesting to kind of see how they're prioritizing certain companies over others. But anyway, I want to double click on Huawei. I think it gets the most heat, It obviously is not, and it's a very interesting company because it's not just it's not only just like, pushing out their own models, but they're a foundry, they're a chip maker, they're a designer, but they're a bit of everything. They have their own hardware. And then they also have obviously then CANN and then and MindSpore that are trying to compete on the ecosystem side with Nvidia. So walk us through just Huawei's capabilities, Huawei's competitive edge, and then why Huawei was put on the entity list and got so much heat over the last couple of years.
Great question. You're really asking good questions here, but there's and I've written so much on this. So look, Huawei, if you remember, was primarily a telecommunications equipment company. um, in the 2020, up until say 2018, 2019, and then Huawei got into the handset business too, right? They started building smartphones. They were ramping up, they were competing and out competing in some sense Samsung and Apple. And then the U.S. put Huawei on the entity list in 2019, May of 2019. I still remember where I was when I heard they were put on the entity list. It's like when I remember where I was when the Pope was shot. And then they were even more critical in 2020. The US added this so-called foreign direct product rule, which meant that Huawei could not um, manufacture its designs at TSMC, basically. And I remember being at Huawei in 2019 when I toured their headquarters in Shenzhen, and they showed me very proudly all of the semiconductor designs they were doing at the most very advanced nodes for all of their product lines. But at the time, those were there was more focus on telecommunications equipment and also on cloud and on servers for clouds, the Kunpeng series of chips, for example. So anyway, so Huawei, and the secret there that still is important is that Huawei had spent a lot of effort to develop that design team for those semiconductors, right? So I mentioned earlier how hard it is to do that. Huawei had, over the about a 10-year period, had developed this arm of the company called HiSilicon. Designing by the 2020 timeframe, was designing cutting edge chips, on par with like Qualcomm and Nvidia, even in some of the other areas. And it was getting better and better before the U.S. basically, by putting Huawei on the entity list, HiSilicon was also there. So then HiSilicon could not use TSMC. But in the process, HiSilicon, of doing some generations of chips at TSMC, HiSilicon gained a lot of knowledge about both semiconductor design and how to use those complicated tools, those EDA tools, and how to do manufacturing. Because when you're doing design and you're working with a fab like TSMC, you learn a lot about how that happens. So HiSilicon is sort of the secret weapon, and if you will, of Huawei. And so after the U.S. controls, the Huawei kept HiSilicon designing. The designers kept designing, even though they didn't have a place to manufacture yet, right? And then eventually SMIC, working with Huawei, figured out how to do all these optimizations of their existing equipment, this DUV equipment, to allow Huawei to manufacture designs. Even though they weren't the most advanced process, they were still pretty good, right? And Huawei made all these innovations in terms of overcoming some of the limitations not having access to the latest and greatest tools meant, which was, for things like power consumption and other things. They designed around this, right? So that's the other sort of, this is a theme that that I'm sure you're familiar with, is, the export controls Chinese companies to do different things and optimize things. This is what happened with DeepSeek, right? And other Chinese companies that don't have access to all the latest and greatest Nvidia chips. So same thing with Huawei. They figured out how to design around this. Now, the other thing they did, of course, which I don't think you mentioned, was software, right? Because the US controls, for example, restricted access to Google mobility services for their handsets, Huawei had to invent Harmony, the Harmony operating system, right? So Huawei had to become a software company, right? Which they didn't really want to do. Arguably, I talked to the senior Huawei officials and they were like, wow, if we could use Android, why would we go to all the trouble of having to invest in and build a whole new operating system for which it doesn't generate any revenue, right? It's sort of a cost center for Huawei, but they had to do it because they were under pressure. And so as part of that process, it's important to understand that, because now we get to the AI stack that you mentioned, the AI era. So Huawei has, as a result of US export controls and having to develop Harmony, they have now know sort of the process of how to develop a software ecosystem, and how to get developers to use it, right? Although again, with AI, it's harder, right? So you mentioned CANN, the compute architecture for neural networks, which is Huawei's equivalent of CUDA, which is the sort of developer and software development environment that's critical for Nvidia. So yes, Huawei is trying to now develop, as it did with Harmony OS, and that was a long process, by the way, a long and hard process. It wasn't easy to do. And still, right? Still, companies in China smartphone companies still use Android, right? They don't all use Harmony, but Harmony is sort of a cross device thing that, goes for automobiles. You can use it on your car for the Huawei invested EVs. So it's a pretty good system. I've seen it when you go with your phone to your car. It's all seamless, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, so Huawei knows how to do software development in a complex hardware environment now. And so for AI, which is harder, they're doing CANN is something that they're working with, and then also MindSpore is sort of the equivalent of like PyTorch, and it's a development environment that AI developers use. And so they've come a long way on that. In 2020, 2022, 2023, because Chinese AI companies could still use Nvidia, nobody was using CANN and Huawei. But now DeepSeek and Zhipu, and even Meituan, which looks like they have trained their trillion parameter model on 50,000 ascends. This is something that Meituan has claimed, and then now we have Minimax saying they're going to do a 2.7 trillion parameter model. They're all working with Huawei to optimize some of the aspects of that software development environment. Now it's complicated because there's training and there's inference, and so there's different needs for each of those in terms of development. But the U.S. export controls have forced the Chinese model developers to work very closely with Huawei, because Huawei is the main alternative, right? And the Chinese government, of course, has been encouraging this. And so, now we're in the situation where the development environment around the Huawei and the Sens and CAN and MindSpore is much better, arguably, than it was even a year ago. When I was at the World AI Conference last year in Shanghai, I talked to a lot of companies that, various capabilities using Huawei Sense, and they said that the Huawei system was hard to work with. They wouldn't tell me this, they didn't want to be quoted on this, but they said, they were being told to use Huawei hardware, but it was hard for them to offer the kinds of services they were offering with Huawei hardware, the same caliber of as with Nvidia. But now I think that gap is closing. It's not like everybody in all the AI developers are rushing to Huawei, but the complicated mix of both Nvidia hardware and as we'll see now, the Chinese government is allowing 10 companies to buy these H200 GPUs, which we'll talk about. Anyway, so it's a very complicated and heterogeneous compute environment in China. But one thing we can say with some certainty is the Huawei ecosystem, export controls, and because they're collaborating closely with DeepSeek, which is very good at programming the hardware, for example, that environment is at a stage where probably it wouldn't have been without the export controls. And so we're in, it's getting better and better. And because companies are going to have to use it at some point, they're sort of deciding, like DeepSeek is deciding, well, we better put a lot of effort into helping optimize development.
I think I agree with you and what I've been here on the ground as well. A lot of developers saying like if they had a choice, they wouldn't really leave CUDA just so much better. But if they don't have a choice, it's kind of like, damn it, I'll have to try to learn how to use this. And even if it's not as good, like it's also like a chicken egg thing. The more developers on it, the better the software and the system.
Exactly.
But I want to play devil's advocate here. Like obviously we all heard the Dorkesh Jensen like interview, right? So like we don't have to get into the details of that, but part of
We
the
all enjoyed
argument
that. It was quite entertaining.
but part of, what you just talked about was like, High Silicon kind of got shafted. They couldn't get access to certain machinery. Obviously right now we can say that objectively, factually, Chinese chips are probably not as good as the leading chips globally. So thus, some may argue export control worked, right? Like, so what's your view on that?
That's a rather large topic. So again, depends on what you mean by worked. So look, the original goal of the export controls, as calculated in the actual register notice in October of 2022, was originally related to to sort of military and other sort of nefarious end uses of AI, right? But the real driving force, if you will, was really this idea of slowing Chinese companies' ability to develop frontier models down so that the US would get to some advanced level of AI first, right? And so if you just look at that and you look at, say, Zhipoo releasing GLM 5.2, that's not as quite as good as Fable or Mythos, but it's pretty good, right? And it's the gap between the leading models from Anthropic and OpenAI and the leading models from Zhipoo and DeepSeek and other Chinese companies and Alibaba in particular and Moonshot and now Meituan and even Xiaomi and Minimax, that gap is still there, but it's not really. Is it months? Is it a couple of months? So if you're going to argue that the export controls worked, then does a 2 or 3 month gap even matter now, right? So that's one way to look at it, right? Now, if you look at it in terms of did it reduce the ability of Chinese companies in the semiconductor industry to manufacture advanced uh, GPUs, for example, on par with Nvidia? Of course, it worked, right? Nobody would argue that it did that didn't happen, because if you're going to restrict exports of GPUs and you're going to restrict exports of critical tools that are used to manufacture those GPUs, of course you're gonna slow them down. But then you have to say, well, has Chinese industry responded to that, right? And what are the costs of that for U.S. companies, right? For example, and then you have to look at what is the retaliation from China to those export controls. So you have to at least look at the picture more broadly than just, did the U.S. slow down Chinese model development? Arguably, the jury's still out on that, right? Because I would argue that the slowdown hasn't really been that significant. If a company like Zhipoo, like who had heard of Zhipoo like even a year ago, right? If they can release a model like GLM 5.2, okay, wow, that's a frontier model, right? It's matching Fable in some benchmarks. Okay, so it's clearly uh, somewhere near the frontier. How close we can argue about, and a lot of that is complicated, depends on the benchmarks you're using. But in the semiconductor industry, you have to look at that in a little more depth. One thing that I've written quite a bit on is, of course, it's forced Chinese tool makers to work more closely with SMIC and Huawei and some of the other manufacturers, CXMT and YMTC. And so the overall level of capability, for example, of the Chinese semiconductor industry to do stuff domestically has gone way up. So those tool makers, for example, Naura and AMEC and Piotech, they're now competing outside of China with US companies in a way that was inconceivable in 2022. And so what happened, of course, is as a result of the controls, U.S. companies had to pull all their people out of those fabs in China. And guess what? U.S. company competitors from Japan in particular, and also Chinese domestic companies got access to that equipment. And they learned things from that equipment that they wouldn't have learned if the U.S. companies had been in control of that equipment. And so that's just one of many examples of sort of the way you have to look at this if you're going to say, oh, did they work? Because as a result of the controls, the U.S. companies now have competitors globally in the tool making sector. So, for example, Naura and other companies in China have been qualified for TSMC to provide tools to TSMC and to Intel and Micron, right? And so now U.S. companies face bigger competition, and the ability of China's semiconductor industry to eventually produce more advanced chips has gone way up, right? So because that semiconductor part is so complicated, the idea that the U.S., for example, could use controls to forever keep Chinese companies from developing advanced abilities is really sort of, it's unrealistic, right? Because this is an applied science, and so the U.S. argument was this is a choke point that we can stop China from doing. But no, China is designing around that because there's many ways to do things, right? There's more than one way to develop a tool, for example, and the industry has pursued many different paths, and over the years, some have proven to be more commercial. Those have been the ones that dominated, but now China is pursuing other ways to do things, and so that's that. So like Huawei, just a quick example. So Huawei you probably saw a couple those last month, I think they came out with this Tau scaling idea, and so the idea is reduction of feature size is designed to increase the speed and reduce the power consumption of these chips. And so That's Moore's law has held for a long time. But now the industry is running up against just the limits of physics in that regard. We're down to 1 nanometer, really small feature sizes. And so Huawei is saying, okay, well, there's maybe another way to do that. We can use a sort of three-dimensional structure here to also to move the components closer together and to reduce the latency between signals going to those components. And so that's not new in industry. This approach has been used before, or people have been looking at this. But Huawei is now putting a lot of effort into the actual tools and the technologies to actually do that at some kind of scale. Now, the jury's still out on when that will happen. They're saying by 2030, for example, they'll have a feature size that will a system that will be the equivalent 0.5 nanometer system. And again, the other thing to remember here is that it's not now just about feature sizes. It's about sort of the entire package of the system, right? It's about the memory. It's about the interconnections, the optical interconnections between the GPUs, where Huawei, for example, has a lot of knowledge of optical interconnectivity. And so you can no longer just look at the individual sort of feature size die to die and then determine that China is ahead of the US or US is ahead of China. So it's a much more complicated calculus, and I've written about this quite a bit. That I wrote that I think 2 years ago. I noted that that now we were in a different ballgame. It was really systems engineering at a higher level that's going to determine the capabilities. And here again, Huawei has some significant advantages. So anyway, so the long-worded answer to whether the export controls worked is, well, yes, of course they worked at some degree to stop and slow down Chinese industry. But at the same time, they've accelerated key parts of that industry. And then finally, I would argue the rare earth issue, which by the way, I live every day because we're trying to help companies overcome some of the issues around these licensing and other things. That has been a huge thing because that was directly responsible in response to the export controls, right? The controls on critical minerals that happened during the Biden administration, germanium, gallium, graphite. And then, of course, in April last year, the controls on heavy rare earths and magnets, right? And so those are still, with us. Just today, you may have seen, and yesterday, the Nikkei had a story about Japan and Japanese companies which have been cut off from rare earths starting in January. They're filing with the Tokyo Stock Exchanges are indicating they're really in trouble out of these critical materials. And all of that is a result of the US export control regime and China's response, which is to put in place this very strict licensing regime around rare earths, which by the way, are key inputs for the semiconductor industry too, right? So yttrium, for example, is used to line etching chambers. And all those machines I mentioned, DUV, EUV, they all use lots of rare earth magnets for various purposes. So every sector produced in the world, virtually every one, is touched by a plasma, which is this gaseous, um, uh, material that's controlled by Chinese rare earth magnets, and the chambers where that plasma is contained are lined with Chinese rare earths materials. So, in other words, the export controls the U.S. Put in place have resulted in this very serious response from China that we still are in the middle of. We don't know how it's going to come out, but it's already had a huge impact on the entire supply chain for the semiconductor industry, and not just semiconductors, but of course autos and power tools and any industry that uses these materials. So anyway, so the disruptions that caused by that are huge. And so when you're looking at the cost, so we're looking at the costs and benefits. Did the U.S. slow China's AI development? Yes, to some degree, but the jury's still out on how much. And then if you look at all the collateral damage that those controls cost, those are stacking up, and there's no end in sight right now. So that's my view is always, I agree that the controls work to some degree, but then the question is, what was China's response, both from an industrial point of view in terms of working around the controls, and then what was the collateral damage created by the controls, and that is considerable, I can tell you.
Paul, I love interviewing guests like you because I was gonna follow up with like HBM in the whole picture, how that affects it. You already answered. I was gonna ask you about inferencing versus training on Huawei chips. You answered it. I love you give the full picture. But I want to ask, what is it like? You talked about collateral damage and how these like industries kind of came out because of the export controls. Now, how do we understand actually potentially CUDA? Sorry, not CUDA, CANN taking some market share. I wouldn't say lead at all, but some market share away from CUDA and potentially courting more developers globally, maybe beyond just China. How does that new ecosystem and operating system work? Because I would challenge and say Harmony at this point is still nowhere close to being a dominant operating system, right? So despite you making the point that they obviously had to go around it and create Harmony, and it does exist and suffice for their own hardware ecosystem, it's not a leader. How do I understand that?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So, this is an older question too. I remember, that China didn't, there was no Chinese operating system, for PCs back in the day. Remember? So we had things like Red Hat Linux, or Red Flag Linux, right? Which was a sort of open source Chinese version of Linux that was touted as that was gonna be sort of the Chinese version of Windows, because of course China has been dependent on Windows for a long time, and still is to some degree, right? And so this issue of sort of how does how does China develop alternatives to existing dominant software ecosystems like Windows or like Android, or like CUDA? Is a really good question, and it's a complicated issue because each of those has sort of a different dynamic there, and it turns out to be really hard, right? Because developers, and I know this from installing the CUDA software environment on my home computer, where I run an RTX 4090 NVIDIA GPU, which is export control to China, but I wanted to run DeepSeek, um, model on my home system, and I had to install all of this development environment, which is very complicated, which included PyTorch and CUDA and all these things, right? And so when you're a developer and you've been working with all of these things for many years, the idea, and somebody tells you, oh, you're going to have to now switch over to this other system, which you don't know, and you don't know the limitations and the strengths and the weaknesses of that system, you're going to be like, real to do that? You're not going to want to do that. You're going to resist, right? And same with Windows. Nope. When Chinese companies were using Windows and somebody said, "Hey, here's Red Flag Linux," which of course wasn't very good, oh, by the way, you can't run all your Windows applications under Red Flag Linux. So you're going to have to run, weird open source versions of all your favorite programs. Again, I did that for a while. I actually ran Linux exclusively for a while, but then I ended up coming back to Windows because there was certain things I couldn't do. So same thing here, and same thing with Android and Harmony. So but as I said, when Huawei first started on Harmony, they had a hard time convincing developers in China to use Harmony. But now, I think that process is pretty far along, and probably just recently, other companies are starting to use Harmony, and so and again, it depends on their business model. If you're a Xiaomi and you want to sell handsets outside of China, you're probably going to go with Android, because you can still use Google Mobility Services, right? I mean, it was really a devilishly clever thing for the Trump administration to control access to Google Mobility Services, because that really killed Huawei's handset business outside, and that was a key source of revenue, by the way. So that was not an accident, right? Like, at one level, it was like, why should they do that, right? It's not a military technology. It's YouTube and Gmail, right? But the reason was they really wanted to kill Huawei's handset business, and so that's why they targeted that. But other Chinese companies can still use Google Mobility Services. So Huawei, in that case, is operating in an environment where Android is still out there, right? They haven't. Android is still available in China, so they're still competing against Android. Now for CANN, it's tricky here because in addition to CANN, as I mentioned, those other GPU companies like BRAN and others, they have their own development environments, and those development environments are more compatible with CUDA. And then in addition to that, Huawei is trying to make CANN and the whole environment more compatible with CUDA. So the idea is that, the difference between the two, if it was here 3 years ago, now the difference is less. And so it makes that willingness of the developers to move to that environment easier as you sort of reduce the differences. And so and it's hard to gauge exactly where that is, right? Like, because each different. So DeepSeek, for example, DeepSeek, in the sense that those guys were programming the hardware directly, right? So if you are really good, and not that many companies have engineers that can do this, you don't need CUDA. You can program the hardware directly, right? CUDA is sort of this intermediate layer that makes it easier. It's a bunch of libraries, and it makes it easier for developers to train, use the training environment. But if you know how to program the hardware directly, you don't need CUDA. So anyway, so DeepSeek is sort of unique in that they were really good at programming the hardware. And so that's why it's important that they're working with Huawei, because they understand, the sort of low level way that these systems all work together. So they can help Huawei to improve the ability of the capability of the Huawei's hardware development environment to be more compatible. I think we're in the process of having that happen now. But going to happen in China there's going to be a sort of bifurcated system where Huawei will be and CANN will be used more for inference, on the inference side, to optimize inference, and CUDA and Nvidia will still be used to some degree on the training side. Because remember, it's complicated. Right now, Chinese companies can still, for example, use remote access to cloud services like in Japan and Southeast Asia and other places to train their models. And so they can continue to use the Nvidia development environment for that, right? And then when you get to inference, they can then use Ascend, and they can run that on there, and they can optimize using CANN to run on the inference side. So we're in this sort of a weird world where, there's the developers haven't all switched over to Huawei, and they still don't really want to, but more and more there's more effort to optimize that transition by making compatible. So where we are in that is hard on any given day, is hard to say. But clearly, as you noted earlier, and I tried to stress, the is that for the long term, the Chinese government and these companies don't know what the US policy is here. So we just saw that H200s, maybe 200,000 H200s will probably be approved by the Chinese government, places like ByteDance and Alibaba and Tencent and others to buy, right? Okay, so they buy those, they can use those. Those are really good for inference. They can just, they have a lot of demand for their services. They can throw those in, and they can be used for inference. They can also be used for training if you know what you're doing, right? You can tie a lot of those together. But what next, right? So what is the US government's policy? Trump basically, under the of Jensen Huang and David Sachs, to stop forcing Nvidia to downgrade their chips for a sale to China. And so Trump said, okay, we'll allow them to sell, not the cutting edge, but something a couple generations behind the cutting edge. So hence the H200 class GPUs. But what's next? So if you're a Chinese company, you can't count. Any other company in the world doing AI design can say, okay, I'm gonna upgrade my cluster from H200s to Blackwell, and then I'm gonna upgrade to Vera Rubin, which is the next one, and then I'm gonna upgrade to Feynman, right? So there's a roadmap of updating your hardware cluster. But in China, what comes after the H200s? So therefore, the pressure is and this is why Huawei eventually issued a roadmap, right? Huawei had never done a roadmap for any of this, but now Huawei, because of this dynamic, had to come up with a roadmap. And so that's why they had the Ascend, the 950, the 920 and 950. So now they have a roadmap out to 2030 or 2031. That's their roadmap for upgrading the domestic processors. So if you're a Chinese company, like ByteDance or like, Alibaba or Tencent, all the leading players, you have to figure out a very complicated equation, which is how do I keep my core developers who are using CUDA happy using some hardware, either in China or outside China, gradually transition to using domestic hardware for some workloads, right? And again, these companies can run different workloads on different systems depending on what the need is. And so And then at the same time, maybe they can get some GPUs from BREN or Softgo or some of the other smaller players and run. Those are going to be primarily inference workloads, and so but those are really good. Those are very, very capable GPUs, so they can run some stuff on those and experiment with those, and those are going to be easier because those are more compatible with the Nvidia ecosystem. So anyway, so companies have a very complicated hardware environment to navigate compared to Western companies. Like OpenAI can just keep upgrading its clusters depending on how many GPUs it can get from Nvidia and AMD. So it's a very interesting and heterogeneous situation here where it's different than Harmony, because Harmony is it's still developing. The developers develop apps to run on Harmony, right? And so you have that piece. Here it's like there's inference and there's training and there's a lot of different things going on here. And there's runtime stuff that you're doing. There's harnesses, which are the ecosystem around these models that make them very capable. The AI development environment is much more complicated than just a mobile operating system, if you will. But again, the export controls and the uncertainty of U.S. policy are really, they're there, right? And nobody has said that eventually the U.S. will allow Blackwells to be exported to China, for example. But we're still in a weird situation where can and do access those restricted semiconductors outside of China. They can run training workloads in Japan, right? And so that loophole may or may not be closed over the next year or so. But in the meantime, Chinese companies have options, and each company is different, right? Because DeepSeek, for example, wants to have its hands on the hardware, so they're probably not going to use anything overseas. They want to have the actual hardware, because that's what they do. But Alibaba and ByteDance and companies, the hyperscalers that have data centers outside China, they have more options, right? And some of those H200s, I think, will probably could go into data centers outside China too. And then finally, the CPUs now are also really important for some of this. And so there's no controls. It's a weird loophole, but the Vera CPU, which is used with the Vera Rubin GPU architecture, can now be sold to China. And Nvidia just in the last couple of weeks is marketing that to China. That's a very capable CPU, which could be paired with other accelerators and used for AI training and other things, right? So the compute environment in China is really complicated, because the controls are there, but they don't cover everything. They don't cover remote access. They don't cover CPUs, and so Chinese companies now have some options here. But but again, it's like, what is the 5-year plan? Much more complicated for a Chinese AI model developer than it is for OpenAI or Anthropic, and that's sort of the rub.
I'm really glad you brought up the H200s. I was going to ask you about that. And it's very interesting to learn that the CAN's system is trying to become more like CUDA. And it makes sense if you're trying to entice people to move over. Okay, I have a question. I don't know how to ask it because I've heard it asked in both ways. Some people are saying, therefore, why is China still lagging behind if they're capable of still getting access to certain chips and they're so talented, right? Or the question could be asked in different kind of framing, which is why like, wait, I just asked why are they still behind, right? But others are saying, oh, why are they being able to play catch up if they're so limited to, generations ago? So like, the same question is basically being asked with different framing. At a high level, how do you view this right now? Because frankly, going back to your commentary, even on OpenAI being able to just keep spending and keep purchasing the most frontier GPUs, then the question is that price even justified if you can get almost frontier, near frontier with, 4 generations ago GPUs? Then why do you need to spend so much on the latest, right? Like there's a lot of discussion around that. Is the CapEx kind of justified? I guess this is a big question. See how you want to answer
Well,
it.
sure, because it's complicated. Yeah, no, that's a great question, and you're as usual, you're really good at asking, the really tough questions here. So yeah, I mean, and I think the difference then is that in the U.S., this idea of scaling, right? The scaling laws still hold. So the more GPUs you throw at training, the better the models will be. That's still sort of the view in the U.S. And it turns out, of course, that that may be true to some degree, but there's a lot of other factors, for example, besides scaling that make models capable. There's the harness thing, right? Which is the ecosystem, the orchestration around the model. That's really important in terms of the performance of the model. What tools can the model call, right? There's a whole huge effort, to standardize the calling of tools as protocol um, used to connect the model to other applications. I just hooked up, for example, Claude. I gave Claude access to one of my brokerage accounts, and it can go in there and pull all the data on all my investments and analyze it, right? And it's really good, and it learns, more about,
That
certain
sounds
other.
so risky, Paul. You're so
Well,
brave.
I had to sign away. I had to tell the brokerage made me, like, sign away all the rights to any bad things that happen. So anyway, but the point is that the model and the scaling and the GPUs, it turns out that there's more. The scaling does still hold, right? I mean, Dario from Amadei, of course, the CEO of Anthropic, he was like discovered the scaling laws. And so the major US labs like OpenAI and Anthropic and Google, there's still the sense that the more GPUs you throw at it and the more training you're doing, you're going to get better models. But it turns out that like DeepSeek and others, there's, through optimizations, because they don't have access to unlimited compute, they figured out ways to optimize the models and to enable them to run more cheaply, and that's affected the diffusion of the models. So when you talk about who's ahead, there's sort of raw model capability is one thing, and then there's like who's using the models, and because everybody, it turns out that everybody doesn't need the most advanced models to run really useful applications, right? And so that's where the whole Mabel thing. It turns out that people are now worried that the U.S. government will, for example, cut off access to these models. And so why wouldn't you use a really capable open source model from China like GLM or Moonshot? Kimi is very popular in the U.S. And you see in these recent reports that Coinbase and Microsoft and all these U.S. companies are considering or already using Chinese open source models in production, right? And so the question there is, those models are not exactly as good as the US models, but they're pretty good, right? They're good enough. And so it's the question of who's winning the sort of model race, is sort of less material in some sense because of these other factors, right? And so it turns out that both the model capability, once it's near frontier, it's good enough to run most things, right? That companies need. Some companies will still want to have the most cutting edge model, and also they'll want to have the issue of like where their data is, right? They'll want to trust the company that's running their data, whether it's through an API. They'll want to trust that company with their data, and maybe they don't want to do that, with a Chinese model in the cloud, but they might be willing to run it on premises, a Chinese open source model, and build on top of that. And that's also what Fable and Mythos has sort of forced the issue. Now companies are thinking, why do I want to give all my data to Anthropic or OpenAI when I can run a very good Chinese open source model on my own infrastructure, and I can control the data, and the security of my business model. You may have seen Alex Karp's sort of rant. Some people called it a rant a couple days ago, where he was talking about that issue, where he was basically saying that companies don't want to their data over to these model developers because then those model developers will compete with them
Yeah,
for
they will
certain
eat their
things,
lunch instead.
which
And people
happened
also
like
have a misconception that like when you use a Chinese model, it's not like you're giving the data to an open source Chinese model because you actually can self-host that model in your home countries. Anyway, I'm gonna
exactly, and
start wrapping
that's
the conversation. I
great.
want to go big picture last, okay? Last question on this. The dominant narrative in DC is that, AI policy circles, talks about, whoever achieves AGI first, whatever that means these days, will gain a decisive strategic advantage and ability to reshape global power. So it's very, very scary. How do you view this? Because throughout our conversation, what I'm hearing is that both sides are, cautious, both sides are healthy and skeptical, but both are putting regulatory pressure, whether domestically on the companies or, on protecting them from, I guess, foreign actors. Is this actually conducive for the future? Like, how should we kind of view this? Because it also feels like from our conversation, a lot of these export controls, protective measures are not actually working or actually good for the industries domestically. So just a high level, like how do we understand this?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think at a high level, my concern, and I've written quite a bit about this, is that if we accept this race argument that the U.S. is indeed trying to prolong the gap between U.S. models and Chinese models, so that when we reach something, and I think AGI, I think we're already at AGR, the model's already passed the Turing test, right? But we're talking about like artificial super intelligence, where the models are, they're self-improving, and they're coming up with really amazing new designs or weapons designs. If you look at the AI 2027 scenario, that's sort of how people are thinking. Now, I'm very skeptical of that scenario because I think, we're still away from these models being able to do, design super weapons and take over everything. And so that one side who gets there first somehow wins and then can kind of lord it over the other side. This is essentially what Dario has been saying in his essays, like the Machines of Loving Grace, and the Adult Technology. He has said basically like the Western democratic AI needs to win so that then that can be used to sort of force regime change in China, right? Or force authoritarians to sort of, kowtow, if you will, to the Western governments. But again, I think I don't like that framing because I think, we're not going to wake up one morning and have that capability. It's going to be a gradual thing. And then the real issue is, how do governments deal with this? Like, this whole issue of fable and mythos has forced the issue to the fore of, how do governments deal with even just these capabilities? This isn't super intelligence, but this is like really good capability to detect, vulnerabilities in software that can be exploited. And we don't even have a framework for that, let alone for something more advanced intelligence. How would the government and industry work together on that, right? So there's a couple things. One is, I just wrote a piece in Cairo Review about, when does the government think about nationalizing the AI labs, right? Because people are using these analogies like these are nuclear weapons, right? Even though AI is not nuclear weapons. And I think it's a very dangerous analogy, but people are saying, this is a technology developed in the private sector. Previously, weapon systems that were very capable were developed by government. And here we have a private sector capacity that's starting to edge towards weapons systems with cyber capabilities, for example. How does the government think about that? And the mythos thing, frankly, showed how unprepared the U.S. government was for this, right? If you're in the industry, you knew that this was coming. We talked about this last year at the Paris AI conference, right? You knew that this capability was coming, but nobody in the U.S. government, the Trump administration, was just saying innovation, innovation. China's in the same way, right? How do you balance regulation and innovation? They want the companies to compete, so there's no regulation. But now mythos and fable have forced the issue of like, oh my God, well, now we need to have some government role in determining, how to test the models for certain capabilities, and how to determine what's a covered model and what should the conditions be around how that model is released. And at least with fable, we saw the company, in this case Anthropic, have to, put guardrails around the cyber capabilities of that model. And now finally, the government has allowed them to release fable. But there's still a lot of questions around that, right? So the problem is, if we accept this race idea, then we're never going to get collaboration between the US and China here, which I think is really dangerous, because then, third parties, state actors are going to get access to this capability. And then, the implications of that are really, really serious. And so the problem with the race idea is that it forces that then becomes distrust. The US distrusts China, China distrusts the US. The US is going to could ban open source Chinese models. China could, restrict the release of open source models because they don't want to contribute to the US developing capabilities. So if we get into this race, then it's a bad thing for everybody, I think. So we have the US-China AI dialogue, which is coming up, hopefully after the World AI Conference in Shanghai, which I'll be attending next week. And I think that's the last chance. It's the last chance for the US and Chinese governments to say, okay, we understand, we don't trust each other, but this is a threat, the threat of,
To
uncontrolled access
humanity,
to these
like to
models.
the whole
Humanity.
world.
Exactly. It's the last chance for governments to recognize that. And I think that's the mythos fable thing. The good news is that really drove I think, this agreement in Beijing in May between the two presidents to start talking about this. But it's a complicated issue because you got what is the goal here? How are you going to agree on both sides to some limitations on this, right? And then how does this translate into eventually a global agreement on putting guardrails around frontier AI models? It's the problem is the technology is developing so fast that the ability of governments to keep up with this and come up with, you know, credible and viable structures to put some controls around this, it's really tough because there's just not enough expertise in government. It's going to probably have to be an independent, private sector led effort to do this. And these are the kind of things that are going to be discussed in Shanghai next week. I'm on a couple panels, including some closed door panels where these issues will be discussed. Now, nothing's going to be decided next week in Shanghai, but I think the level of the discussion will be much higher because of Fable and Mythos, and because the Chinese government is kind of freaked out about this. And the good news is that at least at some point, the U.S. and China will eventually sit down and try to begin discussing this. Scott Besson is going to head up the U.S. side, and Vice Premier Helly Feng. I just did with Alvin Graylin that you've probably seen on the ASPE website, which tries to look at who's going to participate in this from both sides, because there's lots of equities, and we saw that whole issue become complicated just in terms of deciding what to do about Fable. It was good in the sense that it forced the governments to have a serious discussion of what are we going to do about this, right? So that's the good news. But when I was at when I was at the World AI Conference last year, I think it was Stuart Russell, my good friend Stuart Russell, who said, he had talked to a leading CEO of a U.S. lab, and he had said the best thing we can hope for in the next 2 years is a Chernobyl-style event, right? Now, think of what that means, right? This is the head of a U.S. AI lab. It that AI could lead to a very bad outcome here, right? And so this is where we are here in the summer of 2026, where U.S. and China both have leading frontier labs. Governments don't seem to know how to get a handle on what to do about that. But the U.S. and China have to talk about it, because if we get into this race, if we basically give up and just sort of say, okay, it's going to be a race, and then what will happen is something bad will happen, and then people will say, oh my God, now we need to control this. Some people think that Fable Mythos thing is good because there was no bad event, no loss of life or no nothing, but it did sort of force people to realize, okay, now we need to do something. That's a good thing, but still, the political pressures and all these things we've been talking about, the export controls and everything, there's just no trust on either side. We've dug a deep hole in terms of trust. Digging out of that, as you say, for the benefit of humanity is going to be a real challenge now. But hopefully, as I say, in the next couple of months, we'll know better where that dialogue is going to go and where China is going to be. For example, coming out of the World AI Conference, they might announce the World AI Cooperation Organization, for example. I suspect they will announce that. Xi Jinping is coming, just to show you how important this issue is. Xi Jinping is coming to Shanghai. So the security arrangements around this conference are nuts. I've just been trying to figure out where I'm going to be on different days. So that shows you how important it is. If Xi Jinping is coming, it's important. And if Xi Jinping has agreed with President Trump to discuss this at some level, that's good. That's good news. But as I say, I think this is like humanity's last chance to get a handle on this, because it's the U.S. and China have to agree. Everybody else matters. There's a big safety community. There's other capable model developers in other places, but really, U.S. and China are where 90% of the action is. And so if there's no agreement between the US and China, beginnings of an agreement around this, then, then all bets are off. And so I think this is the next couple months are really critical in this arena. And, and that's as the technology continues to advance and recursive self-improvement continues to kick in. And as, these things, that's not going to stop. There have been all these efforts to say, hey, let's stop until we figure out what to do, right? Let's pause, right? Who's going to pause at this point, right? I mean, a year and a half ago, that all these scientists, including it from China, signed on, like, we got to pause, 6-month pause. The hard part is, if you pause, how do you decide when to start up again? Right? It would be, impossible. So nobody's going to agree to a pause. So therefore, we need to agree on a minimally viable framework around governing these advanced models, and that's what the goal is going to be in the next couple months. But it's really going to be hard because of the government, the lag in capability in government, and you know, so the Mythos thing highlighted both the need to do something, but also, wow, like it's the people who really
Yeah, we need
understand the
more
system.
technical people in the government. Like actually every government. That's the thing because this technology is not for the layman's to understand, frankly. Like you need someone who's technical to understand it. But I think okay, on that, like I'm feeling serious FOMO. I was planning on not going, but maybe I'll go up. It seems like everyone is going. I was speaking to Alvin Grayland this morning actually. We're working on a piece together. So it's very interesting. I'm glad he's potentially going, Raymond's going, a bunch of people in the circle's going. So you know what, like I think you're right. Like I really do hope that something positive comes out of this. It just seems like it's really hard to regulate something when regulation takes so much time. There's so much bureaucracy that comes with it. And then on the other hand, like exactly to your point, AI doesn't sleep. I was joking with my husband. I was like, I just want a summer. And he's like, AI doesn't summer. You can't summer. And he was like being a tiger husband there. But
I want
the
3 minutes
reality
off from
is
all this. Great.
no one's
Check
going to
out.
stop right now, right? And like there's a commercial interest and there's also the competition competitor, like I guess even spirit in these researchers at this point. So it is going to be
We
incredibly
also
hard.
have massive IPOs coming up, right? We have
Yes.
Anthropic. That's the
So are
other
these things going to be
complicating.
nationalized? Do you think these, like, I mean, the irony in all this is like,
My Cairo Review article that just came
yeah,
out last month, and I tried to lay out how both the US and China view this. And I think arguably already, there is some there isn't nationalization is going to happen in different ways, but some level of nationalization is going to have to happen, right? We're already talking about OpenAI, that the government taking a investment
a
or
stake,
taking a
yeah.
share in OpenAI. So that's kind of a slippery slope there, right? So it'll be different than nationalizing other industries, right? But yes, I think at some point it's hard to see the government leaving this capability in the hands of the private sector fully, right? Because this is such an important. And as we get closer and closer to more advanced, AI, and the idea of like loss of control, like what happens, what happens if we lose control of the AI? All these things are out there, and so I think, but again, we can't even figure out the basic government role in, how do we determine what is a covered model and who is equipped to test that model, right? Right now, efforts going on that I'm aware of to try to figure that out, right? And it's not gonna be just the government. It's gonna have to be a complicated, body outside the government that's independent, that's plugged into the government, kind of like the IEA, right? For nuclear technology.
There needs to be an
Um,
international standard, international organization to
there needs to be
remain somewhat
standards.
more neutral.
There needs to be a sort of neutral international body, but we're still quite a ways from that too. So we first have to get US and China to at least agree, right? Then building on that, there could be potential for some new body. Now, again, the cynical view in the AI safety community is that there has to be first a Chernobyl style event, right? That hopefully
I
won't be
hate
too
that.
serious
Like
before
the
people get
optimist in me
disintegrated.
hates that. It sounds horrible, right? Like
It does.
it's kind of like
Absolutely.
how many lives need to be put like to die for people to take it seriously. Hopefully something
That's sort
better
of
comes out of it.
that's a sort of cynical view within the AI safety community. But that's why I say this dialogue, it's going to be really important to see who's participating, how serious it is, and how quickly something can happen, right? Because the safety community has been arguing we're getting closer to artificial superintelligence time, and so we need to start the serious discussion now. And that it started happening under the Biden administration about this, very thoughtful people. But then when Trump came in, it was basically let's let her rip, right? Like U.S. innovation is going to dominate AI, and there was really a downplaying of governance. And then Mythos sort of punctured that optimism in some sense, and was like, okay, now we have to do something. But having not thought about that for a long time, there were thoughtful people like Dean Ball and others who contributed to the AI action
He
plan.
joined OpenAI. I was shocked to see that
No,
actually.
Dean's great. I love Dean. He's a great thinker on all these issues. So there are people out there who've been thinking about these, but it still turns out to be really, really hard for example, set up a new organization. Late in the Biden administration, there was a discussion that frontier AI is so different, right? It's a different technology. You need a different regulatory structure around this. But it's really hard to do that, to set up a whole new body and fund it and find but now I think people realize, oh no, we can't treat this as a technology that we can just fit into our existing regulatory structure. It's a different problem. It needs different capabilities. And so we need to rethink how to do this. So I think that could happen too on both sides, both in China and the US is, okay, we need to figure out a new structure here. An organization authorized and the right capabilities and the right technical expertise to actually manage this problem, right? I have a paper coming out with the album's not part of this paper, but I have a paper coming out with ASPE that's looking at how one potential structure that could start this to having and both between both the US and China, right? A structure that includes the key players on both sides that would allow this to happen. But again, very tough. It requires a lot of sort of trust and concessions on both sides to figure out how to do this right. And the overarching tensions that you see every day, right, are still a real impediment to this, right? Because AI in Washington, as you know, has become such a charged issue. I mean, people are talking about,
But some of it's
Chinese.
talking point and some of
Yeah.
it is reality. I feel like, at least in the business world, right? Maybe the
But
policy world should have a little bit of that too. What happens on the surface, what happens under understanding the reality and the realistic consequences that these talking points may lead to.
right. The problem is that the, during the later Trump first administration and the Biden administration, this constituency developed around the AI issue, right? This weird sort of consensus that AI and China, we had to slow China down, we have to restrict all these things, and that there's a that was in government, in the media, in think tanks. So there's this huge sort of constituency of people who are wedded to the idea that we have to win over China at all costs on AI, right? And then there's a group, the AI safety groups and others, and then people like me who were saying, well, no, that's not the way that's the sort of that zero sum thinking is going to lead to disaster, right? And that we need to figure out a better way. Like that, the better way is how can we collaborate with China in these areas where we respect national security concerns, but we don't over index on them to the point where we can't collaborate with China, and then it's a free for all, and bad things happen. And so that's sort of where we are now. And I think the good thing is the Trump administration isn't wedded necessarily totally to to the previous administration's approach to this, but it's still you need smart people in DC like David Sachs and others who understand the industry and where the industry is going and the technology, who can kind of who are outsiders outside the beltway, who can actually look at this more holistically and say, okay, wow, we can work with China here, we can compete with them there, we can control certain things, but we need to figure out a way to skin this cat. We need to figure out a way to get to some basic level of agreement here. Otherwise, we're all in for a world of hurt, as that CEO of the lab admitted in a private setting. I mean, style event sounds pretty serious, right? And avoiding that needs to be something that focuses people in DC and Beijing on how to avoid that.
Paul, I agree with you. You are full of knowledge and insights, and you're full of differentiated views. But there is one question I ask every single guest as we wrap up the conversation. What is one differentiated view you hold? You think that's something just very against consensus?
I think that technology controls and the idea of choke points is just bad because we're in a world, it's an interconnected world, right? And in fact, like when I'm working with clients across the AI stack every day, and when I look at US China, you know, y- the degree of interdependence and interconnectivity here is much deeper than people think, right? People are like, oh, decoupling here and there. No, I mean, if you really look at what's happening on a day-to-day basis and the complexity of supply chains, for example, the idea that we can sort of decouple whatever, is just, I mean, yes, we could do that, but the cost of that to the economy, the companies, and to global supply chains is just, nobody has really fully for that. So my, I, I'm just sort of always coming back to the reality of, okay, what is the what's happening with businesses on the ground on a day-to-day basis, and how are they being affected by this, right? And when you look at that level, some of the thinking and comments that I hear that are just are very divorced from sort of that day-to-day reality of how interconnected the US and China have become over the last 30 years. And if we're going to sort of just pursue policies that where that collateral damage and the sort of the full cost benefit analysis hasn't been done, you know it's like, what are we doing here, right? And so I'm always just I'm always just sort of arguing for a thinking about policy that's based on a sort of a really deep understanding of the reality on the ground, and how innovation happens, and how companies de-risk supply chains, and how there are certain dependencies. For example, like rare earths turns out to be a real choke point, right? In the way that semiconductor technology is not, right? There's just no way around Chinese companies' dominance of, say, samarium cobalt magnet production, right? That's a real choke point. Will take 10 years to unravel. Whereas other choke points that have been used on the US side turn out to be. So I think they're just my differentiation is the need to step back and look at this more holistically. What is the point of a particular policy? It doesn't make sense. And is it having, is the cost benefit sort of now on the side of, too much cost and not enough benefit? And so that's what I keep coming back to. And then we didn't even talk about Taiwan. My sort of thing that few have talked to is the impact of all this potentially on Taiwan and the risks around Taiwan. We work with companies every day, and we do exercises, for example, about around a risk around Taiwan to their supply chains. Something short of a full military exchange, which then there's no de-risking. But it turns out that Taiwan and supply chains in Asia in general are so intertwined, that when you start pushing on some of these buttons, I had the worry that you're gonna increase the potential for disaster there, unintended or intended or whatever. And I think not enough people are thinking about that. They're only thinking about deterrence and arming Taiwan, which I think is frankly a sort of a mistaken way to approach the problem. So anyway, so I think that out of the box thinking and sort of getting away from the standard view, which has developed over the last 30 years, is necessary. And I just don't see enough of that in Washington or Beijing. How do we rethink some of these things in the age of AI? So what we we need a US China policy for the age of AI, and we need a technology policy for the age of AI, right? And I think
We
that's
need
where
more
governments,
dialogues. The thing is,
and we
like,
need more
I
dialogue.
hear from so many
Yeah,
people, whether they're working on policy side or the actual researchers and developers, they're like, people aren't talking officially because of all the geopolitical headwinds and noise. And then, but actually, obviously people talk, behind the scenes, but we need more official dialogues to get to more fruitful results. I think more.
I'm with you.
Yeah. So, Paul, I'm glad you're going
That
to
you're
WAIC. You're going to be leading these dialogues.
to contribute a little bit here and there. I mean, I love the people that I've met with a lot of the Chinese AI safety people, for example. They're very thoughtful. They're very good. And in some areas, China's organizations and individuals are leading, but also there'll be a lot of really good people from the broader AI safety community too, right? From the Future of Life Institute, and from Concordia AI, and really good players who are really have smart people that are thinking about these problems also. So it'll be a really good effort. Unfortunately, because it's in China, some of the leading US AI labs and some people and the US government, will not be participating in this. It's seen as a sort of Chinese thing. But there will be the APEC meeting is happening just after this, and so I think there'll be a U.S. presence at the APEC meeting, and then as I said, eventually probably shortly after this, I imagine that the U.S. and China will kick off this dialogue. And so you're right, dialogue is really critical here. And this is such a complicated issue that, the sooner this dialogue gets kicked off, and the sooner that they can feel each other, both sides can feel each other out
It's
and
better to
get to
talk
the real
directly than
issue.
beating around the
Yeah,
bush and hearing hearsay, right? It's always better to just go direct. Paul, I've taken up so much of your time today. I really appreciate it. I've learned so much. Can we please do this again sometime? I have more questions for you. You're so knowledgeable, but thank you so much today. Thank you for your time.
I really appreciate your thoughtfulness and the thoughtfulness of your questions on these complicated issues. You bring a lot to the table here.